Hi. We continue in 1 Samuel 21 today with the seemingly strange conversation between David and the priest Ahimelech in the town of Nob, which begins to talk about bread, sacred bread versus regular bread, and then begins to talk about swords, Goliath's sword versus any other sword, and then soon David is on his way to hang out with King Achish of the Philistines. So to understand what's going on here, we have to look, as we've been doing, at the structure of the larger section, some of the questions that are important in interpreting this passage that I looked at in detail last time, I'll just touch on them this time. And then some key words that really give us a clue to what's going on in this conversation that's designed to allow David and Ahimelech to communicate without Doeg understanding what's going on. So where we are is in the larger chiasm here. You see the bigger picture of 1 Samuel 15 to 31, and we're in this purple section here, and it really begins at the beginning of chapter 1, not verse 10 there with his encounter at Ahimelech, and it will include David's fleeing to King Achish, as I noticed, and that's parallel on the other side of the chiasm down here. And throughout this entire section, David is trying to escape from Saul through any means necessary, and at the same time, as we'll see, he's beginning to gather an alternative network of people on his support. First, there'll be 400, then 600 men, and I want to suggest, as we note what's coming up here, as David begins to gather this fighting family and others, that our initial scene here is part of that process. And so we've been looking at these scenes throughout this section, and we'll see that this entire section here is really chapter 21 and 22, part of this unit, because the issue of Doeg and the fate of the priest is not determined until the next chapter. And so some of the questions we looked at, and I want to bring those up just in passing as we enter into this, is why has David gone to Nob? And we noted that it said he went to Nob first to Ahimelech, and highlighting Nob over the individual. And this dialogue, what's really going on here? And I'll try to play some of that as we go. Who are the young men that are mentioned here that there aren't any of? The initial point of Ahimelech's trembling was that David has come unaccompanied, and yet there's an appointment for young men, and the young men are referred to here. So we'll get to that in a minute. Why is Doeg introduced in the middle of the dialogue, and what's he doing there? What about Goliath's sword? What's it doing there, and why is that mentioned? And then why does David leave Nob and go to King Achish of Gath, a Philistine, right after this scene? So those are some of the questions we're going to look at. And as we do, we know that the Hebrew Bible often uses key words as a way of highlighting themes. Just a reminder, if you're not familiar, that in the biblical Hebrew, there aren't many of the procedures that we have in written English or other modern languages to help us understand what's going on, like punctuation, capitalization, spaces, paragraph marks, all those kinds of things. So key words are often used to highlight. I've heard that word before a few times here. That's what's going on. And this phrase, under your hand, is key here. And I want to note, and we'll look at this in detail, that the New RSV has at hand, and my research has shown, and other scholars have seen, that that's completely wrong and highly misleading here for a reason we'll look at in a minute. But it's repeated 3 times in the first couple of verses here, and then it'll come back again in the sword issue. The young men are noted twice here. The question of whether they've been kept from women, and we might wonder, what is that about? Why does that matter? There are no young men. So we'll look at that also. There's a play of words on vessels. The New RSV has vessels here, but has weapons down here. And the word can mean either one, but I wanted to highlight the key word there. And then the question of bread, so many times here, and the question of holy, the vessels being holy and the bread being holy. And then the priest being mentioned. Ahimelech was mentioned as priest Ahimelech here, we see, but now it's simply the priest, the priest, the priest, with this one example, Ahimelech here, and then the priest. So it's highlighting his role and not his individual person. And we'll note as we look both at this scene and what follows, the only priests we've seen before are the sons of Eli, way back in the beginning when Eli's sons were shown as corrupt, and there was a curse given to the house of Eli because of its failure to uphold holiness at the time, because the sons were corrupt, and yet we're going to see that the family of Eli is going to make an interesting comeback here. So just to return briefly to where we were, David has made up this superficial excuse for why he's there, that the king, which Doeg, who we're going to find out in momentarily is there, must assume is Saul, but readers can interpret as Yahweh if we want, but it's all very vague, a matter that I can't talk about, and I'm meeting my men at such and such a place. And what it seems to be, and I noted last time that scholar Pamela Reese has brought this up, that David is temporizing. He's seen Doeg there, and although he's come to the place of the priest, and we'll look at the reasons reason for that in a moment. Once Doeg is there, he realized he can't speak openly. So the rest of this conversation between David and Ahimelech, I'd like to suggest, is a temporizing obfuscation so they can understand what's going on, and Doeg does not. And with that premise in mind, let's look at how it unfolds. So David says, having been given this false plan that he's out on a mission for the king, now then, what have you? And the ORSV has at hand, but I have under your hand. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. I want to highlight a couple things. At hand suggests what's available. What do you have in the room, or what do you have, here? But the phrase under your hand very specifically means something else. It means under a control, and almost always oppressive control. It's used 18 times in the Masoretic text and 4 times in these 7 verses. Let's look at a few examples of it from the Masoretic text. So twice in Genesis, where Hagar is told to return to her mistress Sarai and be under her hand. Later in Genesis, within the Joseph story, we hear that lay up grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities. And again, in Exodus, we hear under the hand of Pharaoh, that Yahweh has delivered them from under the hand of Pharaoh. Later in Kings, Edom revolts from under the hand of Judah, just as Israel revolted from under the hand of the Arameans. Here in an Isaiah context where it's suggesting there's chaos, that even a relative, a member of the clan, shall have a cloak and be our leader, and this heap of ruin shall be under your hand, mocking monarchical power. And then in the psalm, their enemies oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection under their hand. So consistently in all these examples, and I didn't put all 18 of them or all 14 outside of our passage, you can see plainly that under your hand has everything to do with not availability, but control. So what David is asking here is, what is under your control? Notice before he asks for bread, he's basically asking that, what is under your control? And with that in mind, we can recognize that what's at issue here is David is seeking priestly support for his reign. He knows that Yahweh has anointed him. He knows that via Sam, he's chosen him, that Samuel has officially anointed him. But plainly, Saul continuing to be king, and so he needs support. And one of the first things to get for support is the priests, which give the sense of the people that Yahweh is on your side. One of the recognitions we have to look at here is we know little about what this kind of priest, Ahimelech, is doing in this town of Nob. This is not Jerusalem where there's a temple and formal procedures. And if you think of priests in a church, Catholic or Episcopal or otherwise, this is not that. We have no idea what this priest does other than what's described here, that he has the power, the authority to contrast holy bread with ordinary bread. And other than that, we have no idea what he does. But we're going to find out there's 85 priests at least in the town of Nob. And so it's a town of holy people, priests here. And in some way or another, the priest's job is to intercede and determine Yahweh's will. And we'll see in the next chapter, when Saul confronts Ahimelech on what his relationship with David and Yahweh has been, he will confess that he has inquired to Yahweh on David's behalf many times. Whatever we might think of that inquiry, whether we think it's a true, prayerful, deep relationship with Yahweh, or a more mechanical means, as we've looked at other times through the Thummim and Urim, which are more like throwing dice to determine will, or like a magic 8-ball toy that predicts something, but it's really only mechanical. We can't know that. But we can know that the presence of a priest in the royal court gives it legitimacy. And to highlight that, let's look at what we see in 2 Samuel 8 when David is established in his reign over Israel and Judah. We see this narrative summary here. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Eluid, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests, etc. So Zadok, son of Ahitub, who is the brother of Ahimelech, and the Ahimelech here, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, is a nephew. And so David is going to have as his royal priest when he establishes his reign, which is really just a few years down the road, family members of this priest Ahimelech, who, spoiler alert, is going to be murdered in the scene by Doeg, along with the other priests. So in highlighting not only that it's the same family, but that the priests are there along with the military leaders, and these people at the bottom, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, those are basically the mercenary hired army. And so the priests in that little litany are surrounded by the military support. And we're going to see that's exactly what's at issue in our passage. David is seeking to get both the religious and the military support through the vehicle of the priests that will begin to establish the public legitimacy of his reign in place of Saul. So with that lens in mind, let's look at our passage as it unfolds. So then, now what have you under your hand. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever it is here. And notice that David doesn't ask for holy bread or any other kind of bread. And as Bodner notes down in my note below, this is an underhanded way of coming up with a pretext for this visit. If David really needed food and supplies, it is puzzling why he would go to the sanctuary at Nob. The request for bread is a bogus excuse. David has no men, but he needs the diversion because he realized that danger is lurking in the sanctuary. And that's, of course, because of the presence of Doeg. So Bodner has already noted that here, and many people have suggested the 5 loaves here is a recollection of the 5 smooth stones with which he pulled out of the stream. Only used one of them on Goliath, and that recollection may well be important because we'll see that Ahimelech knows a lot about David's relationship with Goliath. So notice now the priest, not Abiathar the priest, but the priest, answered David, I have no ordinary bread at hand, only holy bread. And my note below says, the priest is helping David in a cultic way, just as Michal hoodwinks Saul's agents by means of teraphim, and Jonathan misleads his father with a fake excuse about the family sacrifice in Bethlehem. So in other words, yet one more person using the angle they have, just as Michal had access to the bed and Jonathan had access to the swords, the arrows that misled his father. So Ahimelech has access to this bread. And so the priest answered, I have no ordinary bread or profane or common bread. It's only here in the next verse, the Deuteronomistic history, which is not otherwise concerned with things like this. It is mentioned in Leviticus, and the exilic prophet Ezekiel writes several times about the importance of separating the profane from the sacred. But those are almost certainly both texts written later than our rise to power story of David here. So we can't assume that the authors here know about this, but there certainly is a distinction in the mind of Ahimelech, and certainly therefore in the minds of the audience, that there's something called holy bread, and it's different from ordinary bread. But the holy bread here, notice Kadesh, the ordinary word for holy, Ahimelech says, will only be made available if the young men have kept themselves from women, which is to highlight that that's a military preparation. And again, David has no young men, but he referred to the young men that apparently would be his people under the king, and Ahimelech sees through that. He knows that David's going to have some young men, some army to support him as he goes. And so that's what's at hint here, that the question of the holy bread, Ahimelech adds this reference to the young men, and that gives David a chance to answer here that he understands exactly what Ahimelech's talking about. And he says it this way, in a very interesting thing to decipher. Indeed, women have been kept from us as always when I go on an exhibition. First of all, who's the us, since David's there alone? Presumably that means him and his young men. But in other words, he's talking to Ahimelech about his entire history, not just what's going on right now. The vessels of the young men, using the word kelim, as Alter notes below, could equally refer to weapons, clothing, and vessels containing food, but as many scholars have noted, also genitals. And it wouldn't be surprising here, that's the context. The vessels of the young men are holy because women have been kept from them. So certainly here it's suggesting the genitals, not something else. But notice what David says, the conditions he puts on this. Since women have been kept from us, the vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is a common journey, which is to say that there's no women with them whenever they're going on any kind of expedition. But what would be a common journey here? How would this be different than that? What would make this be a how much more today? What is he contrasting here between a common journey and the journey he's on? And I'd like to suggest that that's David's way of saying to Ahimelech, the journey of him becoming king, which is a holy journey. It's not just a common journey, an everyday war, but it's the journey to take his power as king that Yahweh has anointed him for. And so with that understanding, the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no other bread there except the bread of the presence, which literally is the bread of the face, which the narrator adds here is removed from before Yahweh to be replaced by hot bread and the day is taken away. And that really highlights that there's not really a question of bread. Certainly a town that has 85 priests, and as we'll see, women and children, has no shortage of bakeries and bread. And if David were hungry, if this is an issue of food, then there'd certainly be plenty of bread around. It can't be a town where they would have no bread. But plainly, David is by himself, and the issue is not hunger. The issue is the symbolism of are we in communion with each other? In other words, using an etymology that is not from the Hebrew, but from the French via English, are we companions? Which is to say, do we share bread together? And so the priest giving David the holy bread is to highlight that the priest is giving, as he understands, it's Yahweh's blessing to David's journey in opposition to Saul. It's not a question of food. And that's where we hear right in the center the question of Doeg here, which we need to look at in just a little bit of detail. On the right side, you can see I've separated it out. Now, out of nowhere, the narrator announced a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day. Why he's there, we have no idea. Detained before the Lord, or as Reese suggests from this phrase here, constrained before Yahweh. And there are a number of issues there. He's an Edomite. So would he be worshiping Yahweh? Or has Saul sent him on some mission there? Because maybe Saul is already suspicious that Ahimelech and the priests are not on his side. So we can't know whether it's detained or somehow hindered, whether it's the sake of he's trying to do something for Yahweh, that Doeg, although an Edomite, would worship Yahweh. That's certainly possible, but we don't know that. And given the character that unfolds from him, it's certainly not likely that he's seeking Yahweh's will here. But he's certainly constrained in this place for reasons that aren't clear. And then he's described as the chief of Saul's shepherds. And many scholars have tried to figure out what's going on there. And for quite a while, scholars tried to change the meaning of that, saying the chief of the shepherds would not be the person who has the power that Doeg is shown to have to be able to slaughter all these priests with royal authority. So they want to change it from the Roim to Rishim, thinking it was a scribal mistake, and make it bodyguard. But more recent scholarship has shown that in adjacent texts like Babylonians and others, that a foreigner described as putting in charge of minding the flock instead of Yahweh's chosen candidate can mean someone who's a right-hand man to the king. So the symbolic title of chief of shepherds might well mean that they put a foreigner in the right hand of Saul, the king. And of course, a shepherd as a position of power highlights the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, traditionally understood as a psalm of David, but we don't need to get into that question here. So with a note that Doeg is there and that he's somebody important to Saul, the text turns back to David turning to Ahimelech with a second question. Notice it's Ahimelech here and not the priest. Is there no spear or sword here with you? And notice it changes the topic completely, reversing, as my note suggests before from Falcom, the more common sword or spear, and may indicate that the relationship David has with weapons experiences a change due to the change in his existence. Maybe, but I want to suggest that there's something a little more specific going on here as the story unfolds. So, sword or spear with you here, or also literally under your hand. The New RSV covering that over in a different way than it did earlier with at hand. I did not bring my sword or my weapons with me because the king's business required haste. Now, that's transparent nonsense, and it's amazing that Doeg would even think that. How much hurry could there be that you wouldn't have time just to grab your sword or some other weapon? It's not like that takes a lot of preparation. Oh, I forgot my sword because I was in a hurry. That doesn't seem likely, does it? But Doeg doesn't seem to challenge that question. But it's highlighting that David needs Ahimelech's help, both on the religious side and on the military side. So the note below notes that David's career began in celebration of his absence of a sword, and now his impending role as king calls for him to take the sword of his enemy, as we'll see in a moment. Did not bring my sword or my vessels with me. And here that obviously can't be genitals. He's got to have those with him. But notice it connects back with the previous scene about the young men and their vessels, because the king's business required haste. And so now something totally surprising, a plot surprise here. The priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. What in the world is it doing there? When we saw Goliath killed back in chapter 17, we had no sense that the sword went anywhere, and how would it have gotten here? Did David know it was there? You certainly think that something as famous as the sword of Goliath, people would know where it is, and so maybe we can infer that David knew it was there, but that's not the point. David doesn't, if David takes the sword, we're not told. He says there is none like it, give it to me, but we're not actually told he takes it, and it's never mentioned again. So I'd like to go back and notice a couple of details that perhaps help us understand what's going on. The priest says, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. Why does he need to say that? We know that. Everybody knows that. That must certainly be the most well-known thing in the entire book of Samuel, is that David killed Goliath. He could have just said whom you killed, but he adds in the valley of Elah, which I would suggest is highlighting that the priest knows what's going on with David. He's been paying attention. From Nob, he wouldn't have known in the valley of Elah unless the word had gotten to him. And we'll see in the very next scene, the word about David is spread even to Gath, to King Achish and the servants around him, that Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So Ahimelech is aware of what's going on with David, and implying that he's aware that God has anointed David as king and not Saul as king. So he's giving him back the sword that he had won in his battle to highlight that he was the one, not Saul, who could liberate the Israelites from the Philistines. And so he says to him, if you will take that, take it. And notice the if you will take that is a double take, highlighting the question, is this sufficient to highlight that I'm on your side? And so none here like it is to highlight that it's not just any sword like the holy bread. It's not a holy sword, but it stands out from any other weapon, just like the holy bread stands out. And so with the assurance, at least for the moment, that David has Ahimelech and hopefully the other priests on his side, David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. And I'd like to suggest one other possibility, although this is only speculation, that giving David the sword of Goliath the Philistine was a way of getting him out of Dodge, so to speak, over to the relatively distant place of Gath, over from Nob, and recognize that would be out of Saul's hand, in the hands of the Philistines. But when we get there, we'll see it doesn't work out for David and have to keep running. So Ahimelech, as we'll see, sacrifices his own life and the lives of all the priests around him to allow God's anointed David to escape from Saul one more time. And we'll see what happens with the Philistines next time. See you then. Bye-bye.